Hi, welcome. I'm Alison from Bag Lady Bird Learn to Sew. Welcome. Today I am doing a tutorial on how to make a Peter Pan collar. This is a request from somebody in my Facebook group. So here you are, Barbara and Lucy, how to make a Peter Pan collar on a bodice. The thing you want is the front and back bodice pieces of your garment. A Peter Pan collar would come from meeting at the centre front and scoop around to the back. So this centre front is cut on a fold, so I'm just going to trace that off first of all. Draw a straight line, starting with the front bodice. So I've drawn a straight line and I'm just placing the edge up against that. So I'm just going to draw the neckline. So from the armhole, going to trace off that shoulder seam and then draw in that front edge there. Okay, now that I've done that, I'm just going to draw on my seam allowance. So we can see where the lines need to overlap. So because the seam allowance is 1.5 centimetres, I'm just stepping around that curved edge. So now on the back neck, the back shoulder seam, I've already drawn on the seam allowance. So I just want to fold that out of the way, because we want to line that seam allowance up on this shoulder seam here, so then this draws in the whole of the neck curve. So we'll do that there, and that is your centre back. And then we'll just draw in the beginning of that armhole, because that then becomes a little bit irrelevant. Okay, so this then is your neckline. Just drawing the rest of the seam allowance around here, because this is your stitching line and that is what's important. Got the seam allowance here on the back seam as well, which is crucial. Okay, so what we want to do now is we want to draw a nice curve around this to come into the back. Now I know at the minute sort of big crazy collars are quite fashionable on a lot of things, so you could do a really big collar like that. So it's entirely up to you what shape you want to create your collar, but it needs to be a smooth curve. So on a pattern master here we have nice curves that we can use to create shaping. If you want to keep your collar shape really consistent, width all the way around, you can use that as well. So you can use if you're wanting to say make it 6 centimetres the whole way around, you can use a pattern master ruler to draw your 6 centimetre line, like so. So let's create this shape. So if we draw that 6 centimetres all the way around from the front neck to the back neck, that gives us a nice even shape, and then we can join this curve up so it becomes a nice curve into that 6 centimetres. So that is using that front curve there, is using the curve from the Pattern Master to find the beginning, and then you can use more of the curves on here, whichever kind of fits. So probably there, and you get a nice even curve all the way around. You can echo that same curve on the back, and the easiest way to do that is actually to cut this out. So I'm going to cut out, ensuring we have the seam allowance that we need on this. So we'll keep the 5/8 seam allowance around the neckline, but what I'm going to do then is just add 1 centimetre around the rest of it, because we don't need all that big bulk in the centre. Just coming all the way around where this would be cut on the front, cut on the fold, sorry. We wouldn't do that for the Peter Pan collar because we want it to come all the way out. So we've got a nice smooth curve there. So I'll just roughly cut this out. So that back edge comes over the front, and you can see the lines that you have drawn. So that your collar is nice and balanced on the front and on the back. Add our seam allowance to this bit. So you just need to remember what seam allowance you've added. It's up to you at this stage, but a smaller seam allowance is better because you don't really want to see this inside your collar, particularly if you're using white, which is quite traditional on for Peter Pan collars. If you're using a white cotton, your seam will show through, so smaller is better. So we'll draw that smooth curve on there. So I'm going to do the grain line parallel to the centre front, so that will keep that in place. Peter Pan collar, and just right on the pattern piece, size 18, and then centre front. That will be centre back, and you can put a notch on where your shoulder seams cross, and there we go. We've just created the pattern for a Peter Pan collar. So you can cut this out now. That will work for whatever neckline you're working with. You will get this really nice sort of collar shape, and that's the front, like that. Yeah, so you can do that whether it's a children's dress or an adult's, doesn't matter. You can add that Peter Pan collar on there, or even if you've got an opening at the front, you just need to make sure that your points at the front come to the correct point as well. So I'm just going to cut out the top of this bodice so you can see how this works in reality. Place these on here. And this is the facing piece, so we'll put that there too and get these cut out. Okay, so we've cut out the Peter Pan collars, and I have sewn up the little bodice sample as you would normally do for any dress. So I'm just marking my notch here. The one thing I did forget to say is that you need 4 of these Peter Pan collars, so you'll have 2 pairs. I'm going around the outside edge of these with a 1 centimetre seam allowance. You remember we did the 1 centimetre seam allowance on the outside edge of these collar pieces. So it's important with your collars that you really stick to your seam allowance to get your collars even, get each side of your collar even and symmetrical. Because it's right at the front of the garment, it can be really obvious when you don't have it symmetrical. So just take your time sewing, make sure you stick to your seam allowance. I haven't pinned this, but you may want to. You may feel the security of the pinning would make it easier for you. If you feel you need to. So we're going all the way around this outside curved edge of the collar. And back tack at either end to secure. So both of these, what you will need to do is go around and clip your seam allowance. You want to clip little triangles around your seam allowance, because what happens when you do the triangles, it removes some of the seam, so it allows it to sit in this space without having bits of your seam allowance sitting on top of each other. So it reduces some of the bulk, particularly where it is quite curved around these corners at the front and the back. Corners, tight curves at the front and back. Where it is less curved around here, you probably will be able to space them out a little more, maybe approximately every inch or so. Whatever fits when you kind of fold it back is enough, so you can even spread them out a little bit more than that. You may want to do some just cuts and then some triangles. Whatever works for you. So go around both your collar pieces and clip into your seam allowance, and I'm going to press this seam open. Now pressing this seam open just helps you set the seam right on the edge. So you can, even if you haven't got a pressing tool that allows you to get in, pressing it with your fingers will help as well. So you just want to get in right on the stitch line, so it just creates a nice sharp edge to your collar, and then we will, after we've pressed it that way, we'll turn it through and press it this way round. So it's a 2-action pressing after you've clipped all your seam allowance. Okay, so we've got the neckline of the dress, the bodice here, and I've got my little collar pieces here, and these will just sit on top of the neckline. Just make sure you've got your notches matched at the shoulder seam, and the points will, the centre will meet at the centre front, like so. So we can then pin this into position, and then we'll baste it in place to hold it there. And if you note the back, you've got your 5/8 seam allowance beyond the edge of the collar, which is how it should be. So we only need a few pins to keep this all in place. We're putting this right sides together, or no, the right side of the bodice to the underside of the collar. I just finish pinning that there. Basting stitch I have lengthened to 4 on this machine. Not going to do any back tacking. And I'm just keeping the edge of the foot level with the edge of the collar, the edge of the neckline. So we'll just come around this neckline. If you were actually making a real garment, you would have stay stitched your neckline first as well. To stop that from stretching out. And you would have interfaced your facing. I haven't interfaced my facing. So now, just coming around the other side, to the back. And there we go, that's the collar basted in place. We'll place the facing down, right sides together over this. So the Peter Pan collar will be sandwiched between the facing and the dress front. So we'll just pin this in place. So this may be a lining, it may be a facing, which whatever, however you're finishing the inside of your dress. You wouldn't really want to do this and finish the inside of the dress with a bias facing, because it's not really strong enough to, the collar might try and pull it to the right side. So finishing with a proper facing or lining would give you a much better finish. So I just pin this last edge in place. So we're going to sew this neckline now with a 5/8 seam allowance and a 2.5 inch stitch length. So all your standard settings there. Keeping that 5/8 seam allowance all the way around. Here, just need to clip and trim it, so I'm going to trim it all down approximately in half. And this is a circumstance where you would need to grade your seam allowance, because there's quite a lot of bulk in here, because you've got a facing, an interfacing, although I haven't in this one, remember I didn't do the interfacing, and 2 layers of collar and your outside layer of your dress. So you've got a lot of layers in there. So we'll trim everything down to about halfway, and then we'll reduce some of the bulk a little more. Top layer, the dress layer. Down another couple of millimeters, and it just graduates the bulk of that seam all the way around. So now we just need to clip into the seam allowance now to allow this to open up to then sit flat. So we just clip, through all the layers right up to the stitch line, because it's important, if you don't clip up to your stitch line, it doesn't open out enough to spread around the curve. So just don't want to obviously cut through your stitches, but you do need to be quite brave with it. That's one of the reasons why I use these small scissors, because it allows you to be much more precise, accurate, than if you can just use the tip of your blade. If you've got a big pair of scissors or shears and you're trying to just clip into it, sometimes you can be a little bit heavy-handed and oops, I've just cut through my seam. Not what you want to do. Pressing this now, we're pressing everything towards the facing, like so, and making sure that that seam sits flat. So we'll check it from this side as well, checking everything is going towards the facing. Your collar wants to go towards the front. So you're just making sure your collar stays with the outside and your facing and seam allowance go in that direction. So we've got the seam allowance pressed towards the facing and the collar pressed towards the bodice. So now all that remains to do is to understitch this. So we want to stitch the seam allowance to the facing as we have pressed it. So you just stitch in 1 millimetre or so from the seam line. Just make sure that everything all that is laying flat. Don't want any tucks or puckers. Start as often as you need to check that the next little bit you're sewing is everything is laying as it should. And it's these steps of pressing and clipping that really make a difference and make it much easier when you're back at the sewing machine. So don't ever miss these stages, and don't ever miss your understitching either, actually, because that would be it just gives you a more professional finish. Takes a little bit of time, but it's worth it. Worth taking your time with things like understitching. Even if you don't fully understand what it is doing yet, as you progress in your sewing journey, you'll understand it a bit more. It's something I think beginners don't really get, but please don't skip it. At the back. Going back to the ironing board, I'm going to press the seam allowance of the facing to the inside. I'm going to press the collar to the outside, and I will come back and show you how it looks. Our little Peter Pan collar. Okay, so this is your Peter Pan collar. You can see that there. Sits flush with your neckline. And you can get creative with the shape. Just draw whatever shape you want, and you can put this onto any neckline. Once you know the steps you need to go through to get there, any shape neckline can be added to just like that. Show you what that looks like when it's flat. There we go. That's our little collar sitting flat on the neckline, and then we can sew our zip or whatever opening we're having, whatever fastening we're having in that back neck opening, and finish it all off nicely. Remember to like and subscribe to my channel for more great Learn to Sew videos that will help make you a better dressmaker.